It's 7 p.m. Tuesday, June 25th, here in Seoul.
Coming up on NEWSCENTER tonight. President Moon Jae-in gears up to promote his drive for peace and economic development on the Korean Peninsula at the upcoming G20 Summit in Japan. And the Blue House officially confirms President Moon and Japanese Prime Minister Abe will not be holding a summit.
A major political reshuffle is seemingly underway in North Korea. Kim Jong-un's sister purportedly assumes a leadership role, while Pyongyang's top nuclear negotiator is said to have been demoted.
South Korea marks the 69th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War with a national ceremony honoring the sacrifices made by those who fought for peace.
And tougher laws on drunk driving takes effect, with punishments ranging from license suspension to life imprisonment. NEWSCENTER begins now.
Good evening and welcome to Arirang NEWSCENTER. Live from Seoul, I'm Han Daeun.
And I'm Noah Adam. Thank you as always for joining us this evening. Our top story tonight, President Moon Jae-in will be heading to Japan this week for the G20 Summit in Osaka. There, the president is likely to stress the importance of peace to the region's economies.
And while the president is set to take part in a number of multi- and bilateral meetings with other leaders, the Blue House has confirmed that there will not be a bilateral summit with the host nation of Japan. Shin Se-min starts us off.
Attending the two-day G20 Summit in Osaka this week from the 28th, President Moon Jae-in is set to highlight the virtuous circle of peace and economic ties on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia.
The president plans to define the Moon administration's policy direction on the Korean Peninsula as pursuing complete denuclearization and establishing ultimate peace in the region. He will also explain how peace and economic cooperation are linked together.
The president's reference to peace and economy is likely to be announced with the world leaders on day 2 of the summit. And in the G20 sessions, the president is also set to hold talks on global issues, including economy, trade, investment, and environment. As for sideline diplomacy at the G20, the Korean leader has 7 summits lined up, both in the form of formal meetings and pull-asides. Those countries include China, Russia, Canada, Indonesia, and Argentina. Not on the list, though, is Japan. An official at Seoul's top office added that although Korea was ready for talks with Japan, it seemed as though Japan was not, the first such confirmation from the presidential office. When asked whether that might change once the leaders are on site, the official said that a summit can happen whenever Tokyo wants one. Observers think a summit might be possible after Japan's upper house election next month, since relations between the two are considered a touchy political issue. Ties between the two neighbors went south most recently after Korea called on Japan to consider compensating the victims of forced labor by voluntarily establishing funds from Korean and Japanese firms. That was a counterproposal to Tokyo's demand that an arbitration panel be formed on the issue, which stems from Japan's colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula in the early 1900s. Korea's presidential office may have left the door open to a last-minute summit meeting with Japan, but the general consensus seems to be that one is unlikely, given the two countries' differences over history and the sensitivities over the upcoming Japan's election. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
The G20 summit will also be closely watched as tensions between the U.S. and China threaten to overshadow almost everything else on the agenda. Our Kan Young-woo has more.
The trade talks between the U.S. and China are expected to overshadow the G20 summit in Osaka this week. The summit, known as the Premier Forum for International Economic Cooperation, takes place for 2 days from the 28th, but Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping have already publicized their plans for an encounter on the sidelines of the G20 to look for a deal that could end the bruising trade war.
I spoke with President Xi this morning of China. We'll be meeting at the G20, and I think that is working out pretty much as I anticipated it would. China very much wants to discuss the future, and so do we.
The trade spat between the world's two largest economies dates back to July last year, when the Trump administration demanded China help the U.S. cut its massive trade deficit that reached over $539 billion last year. The U.S. also pushed for better protection of intellectual property rights and more access to the Chinese market. As the two sides have been exchanging hefty tariffs on billions of dollars worth of each other's exports, the fallout of the trade war has spread well beyond their borders. Some of the worst blows from a prolonged trade spat would land on Korea, as Seoul is one of the largest exporters of intermediary goods to Beijing. OECD data shows Korea's Q1 exports were down over 7% on quarter to $138 billion, the biggest fall in the G20. And the export-reliant economy has seen 6 straight months of drops in outbound shipments starting in December last year. While many observers in Seoul say there's not much wiggle room for Korea at this point other than diversifying its export markets, there are some optimistic voices.
The U.S. and China have previously used the G20 Summit stage as their foundation to help unravel their tangled issues. So it is likely that the leaders may come out with a solution for not just the two economies, but with one that will impact global commerce.
The expert added that in the past, Trump and Xi have already used the stage to hammer out their rivalry on trade with a joint communique at the end of their last encounter in Buenos Aires. And although the progress made there was short-lived, expectations linger that they will do something similar this week. With neither side seeming to give ground on tariffs, there's growing attention on whether they can agree on something during the G20 summit this week. 강영우, Arirang News.
Following the G20 summit, President Trump will visit Seoul, but he reportedly has no plans to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during his trip here. Our Lee Ji-won has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump has no plans to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during his 2-day visit to South Korea starting this Saturday. Seoul-based Yonhap news agency reported that a senior U.S. administration official said this to reporters in a phone call on Monday. He reportedly added that President Trump will be in Seoul to see President Moon Jae-in, and that there is a lot to cover on their alliance and North Korea during their 2 days together. The two leaders will be comparing notes on the current situation with Pyongyang and discussing their bilateral trade agreement, which had been altered earlier this year. When asked if Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent summit with the North Korean leader pressures President Trump, the official mentioned Trump's announcement that he had received a birthday card from Kim Jong-un and said that the door to diplomacy is still open. He added that President Trump made clear that nuclear weapons must be dismantled and that he expects a final, fully verified denuclearization. Thus, he does not see that President Trump is feeling pressured under any circumstances. While not confirming President Trump's possible visit to the demilitarized zone, the official said Trump will head to Seoul late Saturday after he is done with the G20 summit in Japan. He added Trump's schedule is fully packed from that evening until the next day, and that on Sunday he will start the day with a meeting with economic leaders, followed by various talks with President Moon. The senior official said President Trump is looking forward to visiting Seoul and meeting his close ally President Moon, and stressed that it is another signal that the alliance is stronger than ever. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department announced that Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, will be traveling to Seoul from Thursday, a couple of days before Trump arrives in South Korea. Biegun will sit down with his counterpart Lee Do-hun, representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs, but whether or not he will contact and meet North Koreans at the border village remains to be seen. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
Analyzing last week's summit between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Chinese President Xi Jinping, Seoul's National Intelligence Agency says there's been a reshuffle among North Korean officials, some gaining greater power and others losing status. The intelligence agency also pointed out that Xi's visit to Pyongyang last week stood out in many ways compared to previous visits by Chinese presidents. Our Oh Jung-hee tells us more.
Major personnel reshuffles in the North Korean regime seen through last week's summit between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. Speaking Tuesday to Lee Hae-hoon, the head of the Intelligence Committee at South Korea's National Assembly, officials from Seoul's National Intelligence Service said Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, seems to have risen into the regime's leadership.
They say that in a photo from the summit, she's standing in the same row as Choi Ryong-hae, president of the Presidium of the Supreme People's Assembly, and Lee Soo-yong, the vice chairman of the ruling Workers' Party.
The role that she used to have, taking care of protocol, is now held by Hyun Song-wol. Hyun is the leader of the North's Samjiyeon Orchestra and a trusted politician as well. She led working-level talks last year to arrange a concert in Pyongyang by South Korean artists. Last week, she was seen aiding North Korea's first couple. Meanwhile, the man who used to be the regime's top nuclear negotiator, Kim Yong-chol, seems to have lost some status. He appeared at the welcoming ceremony but did not take part in the summit talks. The intelligence agency explained that a greater role is now played by Pyongyang's foreign ministry, leading the regime's external affairs. The NIS said that in many ways, last week's North Korea-China summit was unprecedented.
When Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao visited the North, they defined it as an official friendly visit. But this time, they called it a state visit for the first time. The intelligence agency sees this as a way to depict their relations as those between normal states.
Another notable fact, the NIS says, is that President Xi brought along with him some ministerial-level figures to discuss economy and military issues.
He Li-feng and Zhong Shan both hold posts at the level of minister. In the past, those accompanying the president to North Korea to deal with economic issues served at the level of vice minister.
Xi Jinping's trip was the 7th visit by Chinese president to North Korea since Pyongyang and Beijing established bilateral ties. The NIS noted 2 firsts for a Chinese leader, that Xi Jinping brought his wife with him to the north and that he wrote an op-ed in a North Korean newspaper before going there. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
The World Food Programme says an additional $20 million are needed until November this year to maintain its current food support to North Korea. In a report released Monday, the WFP said it currently has secured just under $30 million worth of funding until May, just over half the total requirement for this year. It includes not only the cost of food, but also shipping and other expenditures. The report added that the organization helped 611,000 North Koreans last month, providing 1,600 metric tons of fortified food and about 1,000 metric tons of maize. However, the aid group said heavy sanctions had unintended consequences of delaying transportation, among other side effects. The WFP had announced that over 10 million people in the north, or about 40% of the population, are suffering from food shortages. Today, June 25th, marks the 69th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. Senior officials, as well as war veterans from around the world, attended an event here in Seoul to mark the occasion. Kim Ji-yeon with more.
An estimated 4,000 people participated in an event held in Seoul's Chongjin Arena on Tuesday to honor the sacrifice and courage of those who have fought for the peace and prosperity of South Korea. In his commemorative speech, Prime Minister Lee Na-yeon says South Korea still needs to achieve its goal of bringing about peace on the Korean peninsula, something that requires patience. With this in mind, he highlighted the government's efforts and achievements during the past year, namely its diplomatic efforts with North Korea to nudge the regime towards dialogue aimed at denuclearization. Citing the summit last week in Pyongyang between the leaders of North Korea and China, he expressed his anticipation for this week, as summit talks are scheduled to take place among other former members of the six-party denuclearization talks.
This week in Osaka, South Korea will hold meetings with China and Russia alongside the one held between the U.S. and China. President Moon Jae-in and President Trump will hold their 8th summit afterwards in Seoul. We hope the move will bring groundbreaking progress in denuclearization and the establishment of peace.
Korean War veterans and their families, including those from the U.S. and other countries that were part of the United Nations forces that fought for the South Korean side, also participated in the event.
Nearly 80 Korean War veterans and their families are visiting South Korea this week to pay tribute to the fallen and mark the 69th anniversary of the start of the Korean War.
89-year-old Joseph Bellinger, a retired U.S. Marine Corps corporal who participated in the war when he was in his early 20s, is among those visiting.
I'm overwhelmed. I can't believe the beauty of what's happened here. We fought for something, and now I know what it was for. It just made my life so much better because, at times you wondered who was fighting for and everything.
Nearly 1.8 million U.S. soldiers fought on the South Korean side during the 3-year conflict, which began when North Korean troops pushed into the south in June of 1950. Kim Yo-jong, Arirang News.
And in light of today's 69th anniversary of the Korean War, our Choi Si-young got to hear from one American veteran who fought in one of the war's fiercest battles.
In late November 1950, about 4 months after the Korean War broke out, around 30,000 UN soldiers, mostly from the U.S. Marine Corps, were suddenly attacked by some 120,000 Chinese troops. This was the beginning of the Battle of Chongjin Reservoir, also known as the Battle of Chosun Reservoir, one of the fiercest encounters not only in the Korean War, but also in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps.
The Marines that were there were very well trained by that time. So the Marines, and we had very good non-commissioned officers, and our officers were very well trained, and they had been fighting for about a month and a half.
The freezing cold battle left many UN and Chinese soldiers dead, but the US-led coalition managed to delay the further advance of the Chinese and North Korean armies down the Korean peninsula. The coalition successfully evacuated the remaining forces, including some 90,000 North Korean civilians, back to the southern city of Busan in what has become known as the Hungnam evacuation. Some war veterans say the battle changed not only the course of the war itself, but also the nascent relationship between South Korea and the U.S.
The link between the South Korea, and particularly the Marines, but everybody in America really, is a blood bond from that battle. Many people were lost. Many people were lost. The bond really is formed in blood and snow.
To remember the fallen soldiers, the South Korean government set up a memorial at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, back in 2015. In 2017, when it was open to the public, President Moon Jae-in visited there as the first stop of his first official visit to the U.S. Choi Si-young, Arirang News.
Shifting gears now, and the head of the Bank of Korea says he will closely monitor developments in the U.S.-China trade spat and the recovery in the chip market when making monetary policy decisions. At a lunch meeting with reporters earlier today, Governor Lee Ju-yeol said those factors play key roles in the Korean economy, adding that the central bank is also closely monitoring the U.S. Federal Reserve. He also said this year's inflation would likely fall short of its forecast of 1.1%, given that inflation for the first half of 2019 was around 0.6%, far below the bank's 2% target. The BOK has kept the key rate unchanged since last November, when it raised it by a quarter percentage point to 1.75%. The total value of foreign investments in South Korea dropped in 2018 for the first time in 3 years, mainly due to the depreciation of the Korean won and falling local stocks. The Bank of Korea says foreign investment positions in South Korea were worth $1.1 trillion last year, down $92 billion compared to 2017. The US cut down on its investments by around $55 billion and the EU by almost $18 billion. Korea's overseas investment, on the other hand, increased over the same period, totaling $1.1 trillion. Korea's finance minister says the government is considering an extension of its tax breaks on electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles at a meeting with auto industry representatives earlier today. Hong Nam-gi said he is looking to maintain the 5% discount on consumption taxes for eco-friendly cars. The measures first went into effect in 2017, but is set to expire this December. He said the government will unveil a set of measures next week, including tax incentives to help boost auto sales in the country. A tougher law on drunk driving is now in effect. Under the new rules, even a can of beer can put drivers over the limit. Our Oh Soo-young with the details.
South Korea is enforcing tougher measures on those who drink and drive. Under the country's revised traffic law, which came into effect on Tuesday, drivers whose blood alcohol levels measure 0.03% or higher will have their licenses suspended. That's stricter than the previous limit of 0.05. Those whose alcohol levels read 0.08% or higher will have their licenses revoked. The 0.03% threshold amounts to about one shot of soju or a can of beer, and is comparatively lower than in countries like the United States, the Netherlands and England. The changes come as the second phase of the so-called Yun-chang law, revision bills named after a university student who died from severe head injuries last year after an intoxicated driver collided with him. The tragedy led to calls for action and prompted Parliament to pass a series of amendments in November, introducing stronger laws against driving under influence for the first time in nearly 6 decades.
Drinking has been seen as a form of bonding and building trust in Korean society, where groups go to 2 or 3 places throughout the night. So court rulings in the past on drink-related crimes have reflected this rather tolerant culture toward drinking, the notion that having 1 or 2 drinks is okay. With the new 0.03% threshold, it is now clear that even 1 sip is unacceptable.
Drunk drivers can now receive up to a life sentence if they cause fatal accidents, and face heavier penalties the second time they are caught, compared to the previous 3-strike rule. While the number of accidents and fatalities caused by drunk driving has been decreasing significantly in recent years, it still accounts for 9% of all road accidents. As the revised law takes effect, the police have also launched a 2-month crackdown across the nation from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. in areas where accidents are frequent. Between midnight and 8 a.m. on Tuesday, the police found 153 cases of drunk driving, nearly 2/3 of them with blood alcohol levels above 0.08%. Beyond the rules and numbers, the bigger picture is to try and change the culture of leniency towards heavy drinking and the problems caused by drinking in Korea. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
2 former aides of ousted ex-President Park Geun-hye have been sentenced to probation by a Seoul court for obstructing a special panel's probe into the sinking of the Seoul ferry. Former presidential chief of staff Lee Byung-gi and former presidential secretary for political affairs Cho Yun-sun were sentenced to 1 year in prison, suspended by 2 years of probation. Former presidential secretary for economic affairs An Jong-bum was cleared of his charges. The court said the length of the sentences was based on whether the suspects abused their power to draw up documents on how to deal with the panel. The panel, comprised of experts, lawyers, and civilians, was established about a year after the ferry sinking in 2014 to investigate the cause of the tragedy that claimed hundreds of young lives. Almost half of the families in South Korea are supported by 2 incomes. According to data from Statistics Korea on Tuesday, double-income families make up 46% of the 12 million households registered with the government. The number of double-income households has been rising almost continuously since 2013, the only down year being 2017. The agency attributed the rise to government policies that help people go to work while taking care of their families. In 38% of those double-income households, the breadwinners are in the same profession. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a new wave of sanctions against Iran in retaliation for last week's downing of an American drone. Iran has condemned the sanctions, saying the U.S. has permanently closed the path to diplomacy. Our Kim Yo-jong has the latest.
As tensions between the United States and Iran threaten to boil over, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order Monday imposing tough, new sanctions on Tehran. The punitive measures come a matter of days after Iran shot down a U.S. drone late last week. The sanctions target Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, blocking him, his office, and others from access to U.S. financial instruments. According to U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin on Monday, the sanctions are aimed at those who ordered the recent provocations.
Along with our existing sanctions authority, we have additional sanctions to go after the Supreme Leader's office and lock up literally billions of dollars more of assets. Along with that action today, we are also announcing specific actions targeting those responsible for recent activities.
President Trump said the sanctions would have been imposed even without the downing of the drone. He pointed to his administration's assessment that Iran was behind attacks earlier this month on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, something Tehran strongly denies. Despite the latest sanctions, President Trump reiterated the U.S. is ready to negotiate if Iran is willing to.
We would love to be able to negotiate a deal if they want to. If they don't want to, that's fine too. But we would love to be able to, and frankly, they might as well do it soon.
Meanwhile, the UN Security Council expressed concerns and called for both sides to solve the dispute peacefully through talks. The Council unanimously signed a press statement urging concerned parties to exercise maximum restraint and take measures to end tensions. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, however, said that conditions were not ripe for dialogue with Washington, saying the sanctions show no respect for international law.
Today, we just witnessed that the United States imposed another set of sanctions against Iran. How can we start a dialogue with somebody whose primary preoccupation is to put more sanctions on Iran? So the atmosphere of such a dialogue is not ready yet.
Iran's foreign ministry said Washington's latest move has permanently closed the path to diplomacy between Tehran and Washington. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif also took to Twitter, claiming that hawkish politicians close to President Trump are thirsty for war rather than diplomacy. Kim Yo-jong, Arirang News.
The Italian cities of Milan and Cortina have been picked to host the 2026 Winter Olympics and Paralympics, beating their only other contender, Stockholm. The decision was announced on Monday by IOC President Thomas Bach and came amid concerns Italy's slowing economy may hinder its chances of hosting the Winter Games. Skating sports will be held in Milan, while most alpine skiing events will take place in Cortina, which last hosted the Winter Olympics in 1956.
A textbook centered on the Korean War will be used at elementary, middle and high schools in the United States. The Korean War Legacy Foundation published the book titled The Korean War and Its Legacy in collaboration with the National Council for the Social Studies and the government. The first batch will be sent out to 15,000 teachers who belong to the National Council for the Social Studies starting from the next academic year. The price of Bitcoin soared above $11,000 on Monday, the highest it's been in 15 months. Reports say the surge is because of Facebook's recently announced plans to launch its own cryptocurrency called Libra next year. Sentiment among South Korean consumers was down in June for the second month in a row. According to the Bank of Korea, the index stood at 97.5, down 0.4 of a point from May. The central bank attributed the slight decline to sluggish domestic economic data, such as falling disposable incomes. Below 100 means there are more pessimists about the local economy than optimists. The Health Ministry will simplify the way it categorizes people with disabilities to be more flexible in its support for them. Starting next month, people will be divided into 2 classes depending on the severity of their disabilities, unlike the current system that divides them into 6. The ministry claims the move will allow them to receive more financial benefits and services. That has been your 3-minute news flash. It is that time now where we take a look at some of Arirang's digital media content.
And Onion News is back, taking a look at some top trending stories.
Hi everyone, I'm Tami, a news reporter at Arirang TV, and I'm here for this special food that apparently Koreans are going crazy for. So let's go find out what the food is and what the hype is all about.
I'm out here at one of the fast food franchises in central Seoul, specifically for fried chicken skin. Right now it's around 9:30 and still there's 30 minutes left until the restaurant opens, and already there's a long line to try what was originally only sold in Indonesia.
I mean, some people will like the taste, but like it's more about famous popularity. That person tried it, so it might be good. Or like, since that person tried it, if I eat that chicken like publicly, will it make it famous?
네, 여기요. 감사합니다.
So I finally got my fried chicken skin, and for first impression, just knowing the fact that it's chicken skin is kind of disturbing, but let me try with the sauce this time. Here. 오, 이건 맛이 없을 수가 없네. 맛이 없을 수가 없어요. I can tell why people requested this franchise to launch this in South Korea and willing to wait in line over an hour for some people. But I do need to freshen up my mouth. 엄청 검해. 감사합니다. It's so black. 맛있네. It actually does taste like lemon and limey, fruity sorbet. It's very refreshing after that fried chicken skin. 우리 언니들 모셔야 되겠네.
뭐야? 이거 레몬 사백도 맛인가 보이죠? 레몬 입술 완전 검해지는 거 아니에요? 먹으면 아니에요. 상상하지 못했던 향. 오, 진짜. 우와. 카메라 못 먹겠다.
Foods that we explore today are not only fun but also tasty, grabbing consumers' attention and eventually their wallets. And whether it's Korean food or food brought here in Korea, one thing for sure that Korea is also leading the world food trends. If you like the special food edition of Onion News today, please like, subscribe, and comment. Bye!
We're set to get some relief from the scorching heat with monsoon rain in tomorrow's forecast.
Certainly a welcome sign. Let's get more details on the weather from our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle.
Good evening, guys. The monsoon front will affect on Jeju at first and then across the whole country by the daytime. Now, meanwhile, the surrounding countries will see some heavy cloud cover. Now, at this point, Jeju and the southeastern coast are expecting the heaviest amount of rain of up to 60 millimeters and a little less for as we go up the provinces. And the morning lows are looking higher than today, with Seoul kicking off to 21 degrees Celsius and mostly similar across the whole nation. The southern regions are looking cool in the mid-20s, whereas the capital still remains hot as it receives the least amount of rain later in the day. Then we'll have a break from the rain on Friday as the monsoon front falls back. But don't let your guard down yet, as it is expecting to bring more rain throughout our weekend. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That wraps up this edition of Arirang News. Thank you as always for watching.
News in Depth is next.